Video part 2 because of a bizarre keyboard error that I don't understand. In any case. Above the military are the ruling class. These consist of the nobles or the aristocracy, the people who are local rulers in nomine regius, in the name of the king. So you have knights who are both soldiers and nobles. They're on the edge, but they're more noble than soldier. You've got barons and counts, dukes, people who rule over increasingly large sections of the land in the name of the king. And then at the top, you've got the royals, the princes, the kings, the emperors, the pharaohs. If you're lucky, like in the Middle Ages, there's a church structure that competes with the state structure. But usually, the church is a kept creature of the state. The priesthood works for the king as much as they work for the gods. Or as in ancient Rome, the priesthood is the upper class. It's one of its duties. You will see this everywhere you have agriculture. This same social pattern, which has most of the people bound by law and tradition to the land. Because without that proportion of people growing food, the rest of the society starves. So agrarian societies that are pre-industrial are not particularly efficient in that they use so many people to grow food. In our contemporary world, in the United States, for example, we are so much more fortunate thanks to the industrialization of farming. You know, people talk about organically grown food. Without industrial farming techniques, without modern chemistry, you probably wouldn't be able to support a global population in excess of 500 million, a billion. How many people compared to the 7 or so billion people that exist on the world today? Without industrial farming techniques, including chemical defoliants and insecticides and genetically enhanced plants and animals, much of the world's population couldn't eat. So while you or your family may have the luxury of buying organically grown bananas for your breakfast, you might think they taste better, and maybe they do, or free-range meat from happy cows that live their life in grass under the sky until they're slaughtered. In the end, understand that if you require everyone to eat food like that, A, food's going to be more expensive, and B, a whole bunch of people won't be able to eat. In America today, we have 1 or 2% of the population that grows the food. Everyone else eats based on what they grow. That should amaze you. Going from this to 1% or 2% of the population. Amazing. That's progress. Now we talk about the first civilizations. First civilizations are called Preclassical. That means before ancient Greece and Rome. Preclassical, that's what that means. Before ancient Greece and Rome. River valley civilizations, because they are all set in the floodplains of rivers like the Huanghe or the Yangtze in China, the Indus River or the Ganges River in India, the Tigris or the Euphrates River in Iraq, or what is then called Mesopotamia, the Nile River in Egypt. These pre-classical river valley civilizations are set up in the floodplains, despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact, that the river floods a few times every year. Around here, we have flood season in the spring. Winter snows melt, spring rains come. They are a 1-2 punch that raise water levels in our rivers, our lakes, our streams. And sometimes they cause landslides. Sometimes rivers go out of their banks. Sometimes lakes do the same thing. And here, we're fortunate in that we have a lot of vertical terrain. It's not all flat. There are parts of this country that are so flat that when the river goes over its banks, you have flooding for miles around on either side. That's the way it is in the river valleys where civilization first sets up. So why do people do it? Are they stupid? Do they not understand that if they build in a floodplain, they're going to get flooded out regularly? Why do they do it? That's a question. You've read about this. You should all have a pretty good idea of why they do it. Yes?
They need water.
Well, that's true. Water is a necessity of life. If we find water reserves under the surface of the moon or of Mars, that radically increases our chances of colonizing them. Europa seems to have a liquid water outer shell made of ice. That increases the area of or around Europa from being colonized. Water's kind of important to us. We're mostly water. You take the water out and we're a bunch of chemicals in a powdery pile on the floor. It's not just a need for water, though. Yes.
When it floods, once the floods recede, the soil's more fertile.
Yep, that's it. It is worth putting up with the humidity, the mosquitoes, the snakes, the crocodiles, the fact that their homes are flooded. It's worth all of that because of the fecundity of the soil. Fecundity means fertility, but it's fancier. And part of my job is to build your vocabulary for the SATs and for life. So the fecundity of the soil, the fertility of the soil, is boosted by that gunk that comes out when the river floods. Why? What is that gunk? Is it just mud? Oh no. It's the mud combined with every dead body and every dead plant that has fallen into the river and settled to the bottom. That makes great fertilizer. That's better than horse manure. That's better than cow manure. It is the best natural, non-industrial fertilizer in the world. River mud. The population of Egypt in ancient times reaches 4 million people or so, which is an amazingly high number, and it's amazingly dense right up against the Nile, because the soil is that productive because it floods. So, pre-classical river valley civilizations are where they are because the soil is best where the rivers flood. Now, of course, when they are able to, they build their temples and palaces, their ziggurats and pyramids on high ground, farther away from the river. But farmers tend to live near their fields. So if villages get flooded out, you just rebuild them. That's what farmers are for. They're little worker bees. Do you have a question? Okay. So, this isn't the first civilization. The first civilization, actually, I'm going to be flipping back and forth between the notes as on the board and as written, and a list of civilizations. Where is that list? That list of civilizations. Tell me I left it out. It would be unthinkable. That would be crazy. Huh. I may have left it out. Okay. We'll wing it. Actually, no. We don't need to wing it. I'm going to flip ahead from Egypt, number 1, to number 3, Mesopotamia. And there's a reason I'm doing this. I should have remembered I was doing this when I wrote my board notes. So we're on number 3, Mesopotamia, 7 Oriental monarchies, which was an old historian's way of looking at the way 7 empires ruled over Mesopotamia and the Middle East. Sumer, ancient Sumeria, is the world's first civilization. In southern Iraq, you have city-states like Ur and Uruk. Yes, the difference between Ur and Uruk, aside from being separate cities in separate places, is the second syllable Uk. Ur and Uruk. Abram comes from Sumeria. Sumeria is the first culture with cities, specialized labor, writing, advanced technology, and complex institutions. It is the first civilization. High-tech Sumerians invent the wheel. Now, you may not think about the wheel as being a particularly exciting technology until you imagine a society without the wheel. Wheels are incredibly important. With a wheel, you can roll things along the ground rather than yanking them and dragging them. With wheels, you can create gears. You can pull ropes and pulleys, and you can do all sorts of things with wheels that you can't do without. So when Sumer develops the wheel, it's a big deal. The big deal wheel. Now, Sumerian writing is written on soft clay with a stylus. A stylus is a pointy stick, although it's often made of metal or pottery. And it has sort of a wedge-shaped bottom. And what you do with the stylus is you press down, and it tends to leave these wedge-shaped marks in the clay. And these wedge-shaped marks, which look something like this, are called cuneiform. 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 Now, sometimes you have a little cylinder that has pre-made, pre-carved, little sticky out cuneiform letters. And you take a piece of clay and gently wrap it around the cylinder and pat it down so that the cylinder impresses the clay, and then you gently pull the paper-shaped clay away and you can lay it down. That can be, bless you, your seal, indicating your rank, your authority, and so forth. Cuneiform is written in wet clay, and it dries, and when the wet clay dries, maybe it's cooked and becomes pottery, or it's carved into stone stelae. A stone stela is a rock that has a proclamation on it or other writing on it. So cuneiform is the writing of Mesopotamia. Now, cuneiform is a proto-alphabet. It is not like the Egyptians, you will learn, a word-character language where each syllable or each symbol means a different word. It's somewhere between a hieroglyph and an alphabet. Yes?
How do you spell cuneiform?
It's in the notes under item 3A3. You see it?
Yes.
Okay. So, one of the things that the ancient Sumerians and others built famously is called a ziggurat. Now, the ziggurat is a stone platform. And that stone platform is really tall. And atop that stone platform are little buildings and structures and things like that. Now, what it is, this ziggurat, which is also listed in your book, it is a temple observatory. A temple-observatory. I could see them building a giant megalithic, that means big stone, temple. Why an observatory? Do any of you comprehend what stellar observation can give early peoples who are farmers? Want to guess? Or do you know?
Prophecies. trying to like predict the future?
Well, astrology, yes. These guys all dealt in astrology, the fates in the heavens, and if you know how to read the heavens, you can prophesy. But more practical than that.
Kind of like the market, because the Earth rotates, and they mark like what season it is or what like kind of.
You may not think that a calendar is a big deal. It's like a wheel. Who cares? It's a calendar. There are no obvious signs of when the seasons change. I mean, you know autumn when you're in it. You know winter when you're covered in snow and ice and sleet. You know summer when you're sweltering and it hasn't rained for weeks or months. And you know springtime because everything is bursting forth. But knowing precisely when these seasons start and end is something that we can't tell from the weather. Because every year the weather is different. Sometimes it's wet, sometimes it's dry. Sometimes there's a late frost. Sometimes there's early spring or a false spring. In agrarian societies, everything depends on the crop. If you don't know when to plant the crop, when to do certain things with the crop, and when to harvest the crop, you're in trouble. And the lunar calendar cannot help you. Because the lunar calendar does not match up with the solar calendar, precisely, or at all. So, when do you plant? When do you harvest? Well, you need to develop a concept of solar time, of the solar calendar. And you can do that if you set up big stone monuments that act as an observatory. On the shortest day of the year, the sun appears just above this little notch in the rocks. That's the shortest day of the year. That's the winter solstice. On the longest day of the year, the sun, at its high point at noon, appears just above this notch of rocks. That's the longest day of the year. In the equinoxes, there are different notches of rocks, and you've got to stand in the right position in order to discern and observe these things. Plus, the solar year is reflected in the stars and the wheeling constellations overhead. So, in Sumeria, the megaliths that are used as temple observatories, called ziggurats, are there to help develop the top secret high-tech calendar, a secret worth killing for. Because with the calendar, the priests can tell the farmers when to plant, when to harvest, and all the other stuff. Even if the weather doesn't seem right, it's the right day, it's the right time, it is propitious, we're going to start. Yes?
What about like Stonehenge?
Stonehenge is a megalith. It is a temple observatory. That's exactly why it was built. We're going to get to Stonehenge in more detail in a little while. But yeah, no, look back there. All those, there's a picture of Stonehenge above the heating controls. They are precisely set so that you can take observations like the longest and shortest days of the year, the equinox days, and other things like that. Plus, it was used for blood right sacrifices, too, by the pre-Celts who built it and the Celts themselves. Exactly. So, ziggurats are what the Sumerians and the other Mesopotamians built. Now, during Unit 1's readings, you read two flood stories. The story from Gilgamesh and the story from Noah in the Bible. The Gilgamesh epic is the first great heroic story that we have. It's the oldest that we have intact. Well, relatively intact. And it's the story of Gilgamesh, who's a king, who goes out into the world and encounters Enkidu, the hairy wild man. Ah! And there's a great flood, and they have to survive, and their partnership grows, and wisdom is learned, and heroism is done. It's a good story. The story of Noah has a slightly different meaning. Noah is faithful to God at a time when people are not. So, God is going to flood them all out. And he does. The saying is, it rains for 40 days and 40 nights, which means an indeterminate amount of time that is a month or months long. The whole world is covered in water. Noah, because God told him to, had built an ark, a giant ship capable of carrying animals to survive the flood and repopulate the earth. And Noah and his faithful family and his in-laws are the only people that survive this. What could this be based on? The story of Noah. The Black Sea isn't always as it now is. The Black Sea was sheltered from the Mediterranean Sea. The area where the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea flow into one another, the Hellespont, the Dardanelles, at one time it was just solid rock. There was no passage. There were also a number of very large watery lakes east of the Black Sea. Two things happened. One, before this, before the connection to the Mediterranean and before the lakes to the east disappeared, the Black Sea was smaller, and there was likely a civilization on its coast. And then things changed. Maybe it was brought on by rain. Maybe it was something else. Maybe there were earthquakes. Suddenly, those giant lakes to the east flood into the Black Sea. Suddenly, at another occasion, the opening of the Hellespont happens and the Mediterranean Sea flows into the Black Sea. In both cases, sea level suddenly rises. Now, how do we know this? Well, geology tells us a lot of it. But also, the Black Sea is really unusual in the way its water is composed. The surface layer of the Black Sea is normal. It's got plankton, it's got sunlight, and it goes down 100 or 200 feet. And then below that is a completely different type of water, much colder, dead, very little oxygen. What seems to have happened was that when this sudden flood occurs, the new water goes on top of the old water. And since that time, even though we're talking many thousands of years, the layers are still intact. If you go diving in the Black Sea or talk to anyone who has dived in the Black Sea, when they get down into the fairly dead zone, just beneath where the sunlight penetrates, it's a totally different world. That indicates a rapid flood. So the flood story is probably based on that. Or there's a terribly floody year in Mesopotamia, River Valley, and you suddenly have, instead of a river valley, a giant lake. Either way, big time unless you know how to swim. So, Sumeria, the world's first civilization. We're going to go to Akkad, and then we're going to go over to Egypt. Akkad is the world's first empire. Southern Mesopotamia contains Sumeria. However, in northern Mesopotamia, a new civilization arises. It's called Akkad. It's a militaristic civilization. It's a warlike civilization. It is a conquering civilization. The Akkadians march south, and they conquer Sumer. They turn Sumer into colonies. The Akkadian Empire is born. Now, here's a vocab word, empire. What an empire is when one government rules over multiple cultures or civilizations. When one government rules over multiple cultures or civilizations. An empire is when one government rules over multiple cultures or civilizations. That is an empire. One government rules over multiple civilizations or cultures. The United States was an empire when, from 1898 until 1945, the United States held the Philippines as colonies. Philippines are Asiatic islands that have an entirely different set of cultures than we do, but we ruled the Philippines from 1898-99 through 1941 when the 42 when the Japanese took it over, and then we helped the Filipinos kick the Japanese out, and the Philippines got their independence fully in 45 when the Second World War ends. Akkad's king rules Akkadians, and Akkad's king rules Sumerians. One government, two cultures, first empire. The greatest king of Akkad is named Sargon. Sargon of Akkad. Stories are written about his wisdom and his strength. He is a war king, a conquering king, and he adds the strength of Sumer to the strength of Akkad. Now we go back to Egypt. So we're doing this somewhat chronologically. So, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. You've got the Nile River over here, which flows through the Sahara Desert. So here's the Nile. And this is just a part of the Nile. The Nile is an incredibly long river. It goes into Central and East Africa, the Lakes region. So this Nile flows a couple of times a year and floods a couple of times a year. I shouldn't say floods. And that flooding produces a fertile region on its banks, which is the heart of ancient Egypt. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Now this is counterintuitive because of the way we orient maps. We orient maps with north on the top. So Upper Egypt is below Lower Egypt on our maps. Why do you think they name it that way? What could be upper and lower about the different parts of Egypt, sir?
The way they know.
Well, yes.
Just like how it goes into the Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah. What direction does water flow in terms of slopes? No, water doesn't always flow south, but I get your idea intuitively, yes?
Downhill.
Downhill. Water flows down slope. Upper Egypt is higher terrain than Lower Egypt. Therefore, because it's higher terrain, it's desert, and it flows downhill all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, Lower Egypt is right near the Mediterranean Sea level. Upper Egypt is higher up in terms of distance above sea level. They couldn't measure it exactly, but they knew. Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. So that's it. These two kingdoms were divided for many, many years. But King Menes, the first pharaoh, unifies Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, the crown of Upper Egypt, I believe, was this sort of blue-purpley thing. It had the head was down here, and you wore it sort of like a crown. It was this big sticky-up thing on the back. That's the crown of one of them. Upper Egypt or Lower Egypt. I never remember. This sort of oniony-shaped pointy crown is the crown of the other kingdom. Sort of like you're wearing a giant onion on your head. I think that's Lower Egypt. I think the other one is Upper. But if I'm wrong, you can laugh. Do any of you know? Any of you remember? Yeah.
I think the onion-shaped one is lower.
So that's lower.
Upper.
This one's upper. The onion is upper, you say?
Yeah.
Okay, and the ringlet is sort of lower. That's fine. Again, you'd think your history teacher would know these things. I teach you what I remember. I've never committed that to memory, so I'll take your word for it. What Menes does is he combines the crowns into a single crown, a unified crown, a crown of all Egypt. You will be expected to know that. So, he unifies Upper and Lower Egypt and symbolically unifies them by making a single crown that is composed of the two elements of the previous crowns of the previous kingdoms. Now, he founds what is called Old Kingdom Egypt. Now, before I go on, there's a special word that you should know. It's not written in your notes, but it's important. Word is dynasty. D-Y-N-A-S-T-Y. Dynasty. D-Y-N-A-S-T-Y. Dynasty. D-Y-N-A-S-T-Y. Dynasty. Dynasty is a ruling family. A ruling family. A ruling family. That's what a dynasty. D-Y-N-A-S-T-Y. A ruling family. In Egypt, in China, in Britain, in any monarchical system, even imperial Rome, you have certain ruling families that pass on the imperium or the crown generation to generation. Who usually becomes the new king when the old king dies? Usually it's the eldest son. Occasionally it's the eldest child, but that's rare. Usually it's the eldest son. There's no son, is your uncle or brother or whatever, somebody related. Occasionally you have adopted rule, but that's also very, very rare. So Egypt, throughout its Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom history, has many, 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 many dynasties. Because one of the characteristics of these dynasties, these royal families, is they believe they're gods, and therefore everyone else has mudblood. And so rather than breeding for what we would call strength, by breeding your bloodline with a totally different bloodline that also has good characteristics, they breed brothers and sisters together. Not a good thing from our point of view in terms of genetics. We've talked about this. It leads to idiocy. It leads to massive preventable birth defects and the fall of the dynasty. The Old Kingdom is composed of multiple dynasties. One royal family starts out strong and then gets weak, and is replaced by another royal family that starts out strong and then gets weak, until another royal family, strong, then weak, strong, then weak, and this cycle goes on and on and on. And it's true in most monarchies, even those that don't practice incest among their membership. In China, you have imperial history defined by the dynasty. There are 7 or 8 dynasties in historical time. In England, you've got a series of royal families, one after the other after the other. So that's what a dynasty is, a royal family. The concept of Mott. The concept of Mott is something to do with the way the universe should work harmoniously. It is the proper balance within the universe. It is a sense that things are as they should be. Mott is hard to translate into English, but it is a sense that the cosmic forces are in a relatively healthy balance with one another, and that life is happening smoothly. Not perfectly, it never is perfect, but smoothly. That's Mott, a concept of cosmic balance and harmony. And Mott is something that every Egyptian pharaoh strives to encourage. Because if everything is seen to be running smoothly, the dynasty will be successful. And if the dynasty is successful, everything is going to be running smoothly. However, if you end up with natural disasters, foreign invasions, plagues, crime, clearly Mott is lacking. The cosmic balance is tilting unfavorably towards humanity, and this is going to make it harder and harder for the pharaohs to rule. So Mott is, you look at nature and its circumstances to see, is everything hunky-dory? That's a technical term, hunky-dory. If you have questions, I assume you'll raise your hand and ask. The Egyptian Pantheon are the gods of Egypt, the gods and goddesses of Egypt. So you've got Ammon or Ammon-Ra, the god of the sun. You've got Set, the god of the underworld. You've got Isis, the goddess of regeneration. You've got Bast, the goddess of cats. Yes, Bast is goddess of cats, and in Egypt, cats are mummified along with people. Why? What could... Yes?
Because they were like defenders and thought of it as sacred because they killed poisonous snakes and stuff.
Yep. They not only killed poisonous snakes, they also killed rodents that would eat the wheat before the people could harvest it. Without cats, the crops of ancient Egypt would be rat food. With cats, the Egyptians have a fighting chance of bringing in their harvest every year, putting it in the granary, and keeping the rodents out. And cats keep the rodent population down. So they defend Egypt from snakes, and they defend Egypt from rodents. And the rodents are particularly a nasty threat. Now, how does the goddess of regeneration work? Okay. As I understand it, Isis and Osiris are brother and sister and husband and wife, because it's Egypt. And Osiris and Set are rivals. So Set kills Osiris and chops his body up and places his various body parts hidden around the world so that nobody can put him back together again. Set wins, except there's Isis. Isis searches through the realms and finds the parts of her brother husband. Isis puts those parts back together and resurrects Osiris, brings him back from the dead, takes his dismembered body, knits it together, and creates, bless you, a new revived Osiris. Isis is revered throughout the ancient world, up through the end of Roman paganism. And Isis' symbol is called an Ankh. An Ankh looks a bit like a Christian cross, but it's not. It has this sort of loop up top. That is the Ankh, the symbol of regeneration, the symbol of Isis. The Pharaoh was a king, but a god also. He was the personification of one of the gods on earth. When the Pharaoh died, he crossed into the heavens and becomes the personification, or joins with the personification, of another god. The new Pharaoh takes on the presence of the living God in the world. Now, hieroglyphs are Egyptian writing. And they start out as pictures of storks and crocodiles and wheat and men. And you have the typical Egyptian art, which is sort of two-dimensional. From these drawings come the first writing system of Egypt, which is called hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are word pictures. Unlike cuneiform, hieroglyphs can actually be seen as being actual animals, and they've got a variety of symbols about them. I'm just making this up. I'm not saying that this is an actual hieroglyph, but it looks like one. And if it was a name, it would have a cartouche around it, which is a sort of oval around it. Hieroglyphs are represent an entire word, like Chinese. It's a word character language. So you've got a single symbol to represent man, another symbol to represent house, another symbol to represent crocodiles or dogs, another symbol to represent Horus, one of the gods. Each word picture is the picture of a word. It's the opposite approach to our phonetic alphabet. Our phonetic alphabet has 26 symbols. And those 26 symbols, mixed and matched, uses most of the 50-odd phonemes that a human mouth and throat and tongue and vocal cords can make. Our language is reducible to these 26 symbols in different combinations. One of the reasons you give children blocks is they figure out intuitively how words work. A, P, ape? No, you need an E there. Now it's ape. Why? You can't say the E. I'll explain it to you later. Never do. Why do we have silent E? In any event, what you need to know about hieroglyphs, and they exist behind Elise over here. On the top of the Rosetta Stone are Egyptian hieroglyphs from the late Egyptian kingdom. The Pharaoh is a living god. He is a god king. So church and state are unified under the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh is a god as well as a man. And if you're disloyal, you're not only a traitor, you are damned to hell. So don't be disloyal to the Pharaoh. Unification of church and state. I guess we can leave it there for today. Tomorrow with Egypt. Questions? Comments? Thoughts? Yes?
So is the Rosetta Stone like a collection of a bunch of different, just all of those ancient stone?
I'm sorry?
Is the Rosetta Stone a collection of
Okay, the
different...
Rosetta Stone was found by Napoleon's forces, and it was a royal proclamation on a stela. That is a stone that has a royal proclamation. And the language on top is hieratic, which is a variant of hieroglyphs. In the middle is Demotic, sort of a middle language. At the bottom is Greek. So, after 50 years of research, more than 50 years, a Frenchman named Champollion figures out what a cartouche is, which is that oval symbol around proper names, like capitalizing proper names in our language. And from that, he decrypts hieroglyphs to the point where today, people can not only read hieratic, but they can read Old Kingdom hieroglyphs. I can't, but there are people who can. So you can read writing 3,000 or 4,000 years old in the language of the person who wrote it down. It's pretty amazing. We'll talk more. Thank you for your attention.